'Cause like a winter tonight, I thought I would always have light. The quick flash that you gave to me, so dark I could barely see. Looking
From wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring the world of mass killers. What's going on in their head? We're going to find out with Mike Roche. He is the author of the book, Mass Killers. Has over 3 decades of law enforcement experience. He began his career with the Little Rock Police Department and spent 22 years with the U.S. Secret Service. The last 15 years of his career were focused on conducting behavioral threat assessments of those threatening to engage in targeted violence. He was also an intelligence liaison to the FBI and CIA headquarters, as well as being assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Let's welcome Mr. Roche to the circle. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much, Carlos. I appreciate you inviting me on.
This is a very interesting topic. I think one is because it's so relevant. We've seen so many of these cases over the last 5 or 10 years. And before I get started with that, it actually brings up a question. I know in behavioral economics, there's a thing called availability bias. It basically means the more we see of something, the more we think it actually happens.
Right.
Have there really been an upsurge in mass killings, or is it just because the media is portraying so much of it?
Well, obviously, there is much more media exposure on that. However, the statistics show that, somewhere around 2009, there was a significant uptick of mass killings. And, you can look at that, perhaps some of it was based on the economy was going down, adding more stress on the environment. The increase of social media with Facebook and Twitter and more relevant exposure in the media as well.
That's a good point. I didn't even think about the social media aspect at all. What got you motivated to write this book?
I was teaching a class for, at the time, St. Leo University, and I'm now with teaching law enforcement personnel through the Alpha Group. And at that point, I realized that, there was an absence of this information for law enforcement and human resources to try to look for some of the common factors and how to investigate these types of cases.
Interesting. Very fascinating. So let's get to it. Mass killers. I know you wrote about them. What's going on in their heads?
Well, and I always urge everybody, hey, you have to look at it from their viewfinder. And I use the term standing there flip-flops. You have to look at life from their perspective because so often they have that they're caught up in what I refer to as an emotional negative vortex where, their entire life is collapsing around them. You can look at them and see, hey, they perhaps lost their job, whether they were fired or laid off, which causes financial stress on the family. Perhaps they're going through a divorce, foreclosure, bankruptcy, and then, the dog runs away and the goldfish dies. And it's all of these elements that, put a tremendous amount of strain on the individual. And if they don't have, and there's people all over the world, all over the country that are going through the same exact experiences. However, you have some people that, have difficulty coping with these adversities. And, if you throw in the element of, mental health illness as well, that can cause a very dangerous mix.
Sounds like almost very difficult to identify, too, because aren't these individuals typically more isolated? They're kind of antisocial in a sense?
Well, and that's one of the common factors that people will mention was that, he was perhaps a social isolate. In the school shooters, we saw where, 40% of them actually socialized in the mainstream. And, whatever you want to refer to as the mainstream, they had some group of commonality. It may have been the science geeks or, the jocks or whoever the group was. They may not have been in a popular clique, but they had socialization.
40%.
Yeah, 40%
Wow.
we're actually socialized in what's referred to as the mainstream. And again, that's open to debate what the mainstream is in the school shooters. In the adult world, yes, quite commonly, they are kind of social isolates. But I wouldn't sit there and say, check. That's what one of the so-called profile.
And is there a definition for socializing? I mean, is it? I'm not sure how that's situated here, but is it defined as going out with your friends once a week? Is it defined just calling on the phone?
Yeah, and I think that's subjective. To sit there and look at it and say, well, do they stay at home most times, or are they, down at the neighborhood picnic or the neighborhood pub and hanging out with friends and relatives all the time? That's difficult to determine. Like I said, it's pretty subjective.
That's fascinating. And why do they target large groups of people instead of a specific individual? Sometimes it seems like it's random, but I can't imagine it's always random.
No, and it's typically not random. I mean, that they have a specific point of, who they're planning, or as far as the target is concerned. But sometimes it's not perhaps an individual as much as it is, say, an institution, perhaps, the school, or it was that work environment that was toxic to them, or, landed up firing them. And, I remember one of them said, that company left me to rot. And that was his opinion of that business before he went on a shooting of the business. Yet, the person he landed up shooting was somebody that he had no idea who they were. I don't think they even worked there when he was there.
That's really scary, because then you really don't know what's going to trigger them and who they're going to attack, typically.
Right, and if you look at them, I mean, most of them have a discernible pattern. It's kind of a pathway to violence, and you can start to see that somebody that perhaps doesn't have any interest in weapons all of a sudden starts acquiring weapons, and then starts going out target practice, or they're making statements to those around them. And we've seen in 2/3 of the cases of the adults where they'd actually leaked. And when we're talking about leakage, it's either verbal leakage, social media leakage, or literary leakage, where they're actually letting folks know in their social circle or their family that, hey, they're considering this act of violence. Now, in the schools, the school shooters, that increases to, if I remember correctly, about 81% of the school shooters actually shared their thoughts with others. And, and quite frequently people dismiss that as being, idle chit chat, or, oh, that's just that crazy person talking, or, oh, I just thought he was joking. I didn't think he was serious, or that he would actually carry out with it. And, that happens quite frequently.
They're crying out for attention, but it doesn't get interpreted that way.
Correct. And I think, we're starting to change as a culture a little bit more, especially in the schools, where now, where students were at one time concerned about, hey, I don't really want to, narc on my buddy there, or get my buddy in trouble. Understand it's like it's no longer socially acceptable to sit there and say, I'm planning to come in tomorrow with a gun and start shooting the teachers, or other students. And now we're seeing a lot more. There was one study done that over a 10-year period of time, there were 120 school shootings prevented. I think the number is significantly higher, that there are more numbers out there that are actually mitigated and prevented by either school authorities or law enforcement. Because what happens is a lot of these students, that they tell a friend or whichever, and then that person then communicates it to somebody of authority, or their parents, who then report it to the authorities, and then the police are knocking on the door.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Now, what's your expert opinion on this? I mean, this has always seemed interesting to me because they get into this Butch Cassidy Sundance Kid mode at the very end. In regards, what I mean by that is they're writing this letter, what they're going to do. They know the story's not going to end well. 99% of the time, it seems like, or 98%, they're going to get killed or they're going to kill themselves. So they have this already idea that this is just going to end this way.
Right.
Do we know, have we ever interviewed anybody who has survived, or do we know why? I mean, is this like there's a suicide attempt, it almost seems like.
Well, it is, and that's one of the primary motivations is suicide. And, the Secret Service conducted a study and found that of the individuals involved or planning to engage in targeted violence, that about 66% of them had either previous suicide attempts or had carefully considered the concept of ending their lives. And there was another study done at Texas State University last year or the year before, a fairly recent study on active shooters. And what they found was that in almost half, 49%, had committed suicide prior to law enforcement's arrival on scene.
49% had committed suicide before, huh?
Yeah, so almost half have killed themselves prior to law enforcement even arriving. And then once law enforcement does arrive on scene, that 30% of them land up still committing suicide. So you can see that, for them, this is a way of attaching some significance to what they perhaps perceive as their meaningless life, that they're looking to go out with a big splash. Hey, I want everybody to remember who I am and who I was. And, they understand that, from now until eternity, you can research their name on Wikipedia. It's essentially their tombstone is on Wikipedia now, as far as you can, Google their name or the event and come up with what the body count was. And this is what they're looking for.
Oh, man. So it's not really a suicide by cop then kind of incident.
Well, it can be, and there are times that there have been individuals that express that hey, I've tried to kill myself, I've been unsuccessful. Why not have law enforcement kill me during the act? But primarily, one of the primary motivations is four primary motivations. The first one being the achieving of fame, that they want to be recognized for who they believe that they are, that they've perhaps been misunderstood, and they want everybody to remember who they were. The second one being suicide, which we just discussed. And then the third one is essentially revenge, that they're trying to, make a point. For example, somebody that's being, fired or kicked out of school, that they then want to come back and serve some retribution.
Fascinating. Did you guys find any other, and you guys meeting Secret Service, did you find any other patterns or commonalities? Was there similar ages, socioeconomic backgrounds, education levels, anything like that?
Well, and when I'm teaching the class, I typically say, hey, here's the profile. When you're looking at the school shooters, you're talking about as young as the age of 12. And then with the adult shooters, you carry it all the way to the age of 88. 88. James von Braun attacked the Holocaust Museum. Now, it wasn't a mass killing per se, but his intent was to carry out a mass killing. So, it's a wide disparity. They're primarily, white males with, a high school education. So I essentially say you're looking for angry white males for the most part.
And females are not usually in the picture, are they?
No, not at all. It's very, very rare.
That's interesting. I wonder why that is. Not the female part, but the angry white males. Why is it such a predominantly, I hate to say it, but a white male characteristic?
Right, and I think for the most part, for men, we tend to be more stoic. We're holding in emotions a lot more. We're not as willing to share what our concerns are. Where females tend to be much more social and have other outlets to release this pent up difficulties that they're dealing with.
That's a good point. Did you notice any distinctions in regards to the weapons they use or the strategies they use? I know I'm thinking in the back of my head, I have Holmes in Colorado locks up a movie theater. Then we have Columbine with guns and he shoots up. Is there any kind of distinctions there? Is there something you guys would spot there and say, look, we got to look for this or this? Anything going on?
As far as weapon choice, that they're typically going to whatever is accessible to them, whether it's in their own personal stockpile or they go out and start to acquire these weapons or that they land up stealing them or taking them from, say, in the school shooters from a family member or neighbor's house or whatever the case is. Now, I mean, there's also been a few instances where, and I always say James Holmes was the type that, he set up this intricate, Rube Goldberg type, mousetrap scenario in his apartment to trigger a law enforcement's response, which by turning up the music. And what he had planned to do is that whoever would respond and open up the door to the loud music would set off this fire inferno and try to draw law enforcement or first responders over to that, allowing him more time. But even if he didn't have weapons, I always thought he was the type that would then start making up, Molotov cocktails or homemade hand grenades or something along that respect. There was a student at I believe it was a community college in Texas that used a straight knife. You had Alex Ribel in Pennsylvania last year, 16 years old, that used a knife and went in there. And I mean, that's very up close and personal. And, when you're plunging a knife into a human body, I mean, that shows the darkness that he was really possessed with.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was wondering too. That's a good point. And thank goodness we don't have too many of those Holmes characters. They don't seem to be doing those kind of devious tactics where they set up a diversion to get the law enforcement away. That's not a very common thing, is it?
Well, I mean, there's quite a few that actually, sit there and, Columbine had actually tried to do that they had a diversionary device set up at one of the parks to, again, go off and allow law enforcement to come in, drawing them away from the school. And then, so as a result, the one thing we do see, one of the common factors with a lot of these mass killers is that they do a considerable amount of research and they look into previous shootings. There was discussions about Adam Lanza had conducted research on something like 500 previous killings and had taken notes. So, there was an interdiction that occurred in Waseca, Minnesota, in which a student there was caught. And it was fortunate, it was kind of a stroke of luck where a woman was in her kitchen, looked out the window and happened to see him walking through the yards. And she just thought he was, conducting himself in kind of a suspicious manner. And she saw him walk across the street to a storage facility. And again, just his actions were somewhat suspicious. She called the Waseca Police Department. And when they responded, they found that he had bomb-making supplies in this storage facility and had done extensive research on the Columbine killers. And he had already experimented with detonating some explosive devices to see whether, in fact, they would work. And wow. And I live in Florida. There was another one in Tampa that also had considered setting up some explosive devices to, again, draw students out in a way that he could start killing them then.
Crazy stuff.
It really is.
Now, the great thing about your book is you also give people the knowledge to be able to identify these, or at least give you signals to look for. What are some of these things we should be looking for to prepare ourselves?
Well, again, one of the primary things is to see whether or not, somebody that has I wouldn't call it an obsession, but a great interest in previous mass killings or assassinations, serial killers. What types of books are they reading? That becomes a little bit more difficult as people are now reading on Kindle and on their tablets. It's kind of hard sometimes to see what they're actually reading. But, I always advocated for law enforcement, try to get into their home and actually have a discussion with them and see what types of books they're reading, what type of movies they're watching, and see what their interests are and try to explore that. And typically, most of these people are of a concern to others around them. And if you start to ask, co-workers that are sitting in the next cubicle to them or on the assembly line for 8 hours a day, you get to really pretty much know the person next to you. Even if they're not sharing a lot, you can kind of say, and we've seen this with a number of incidents, especially in workplace violence, where after it reaches the media, then former workers sit there and say, oh, well, I knew immediately who that was, because, he was always the odd duck, or he was the one that was making these, wild statements, threatening statements. He hated the world and, all of these grievances. Quite a few of them are, wound collectors was a term that came up. Joe Navarro who retired from the FBI coined the term, and it's a great visualization is that they collect, they hang on to these, whether they're real or perceived slights against them, and they just, that they accumulate these like deposits in a bank, and they're constantly holding on to that. They never let go. And they're not always very forgiving people. And like I said, then you have to look at, what else is going on in their life, whether they're actually, they've got, this emotional negative vortex, that they're in despair. A good, and in the Secret Service study, it was 78% had previous issues with mental health. Now, just because you have mental health doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to go out and commit an act of mass murder. In fact, E. Fuller Torrey, the noted forensic psychologist, had come out and said it really is only 1% of the mental health population that you really have to be concerned about. And these are the folks that are truly dangerous, where they're hearing, command hallucinations or, highly delusional. We saw that with the Navy Yard shooter, where, he was, he had even called the police in Newport, Rhode Island, to say, hey, I'm being stalked by this, elderly couple from, Virginia, and, they're beaming microwaves in through the walls and the floor and whatnot. And, he was very disturbed by this. And, the police department made notification, like they should have, to notify somebody, to say, hey, we think something's going on here, and notify the Department of Navy. And, apparently they didn't act upon it. And he eventually moved down from Newport to Washington, D.C., where he went on the shooting. But he had, significant issues with, hearing voices and, perhaps seeing, different hallucinations, and highly delusional as well.
So it's really important to have a comprehensive look. You want to be able to listen to those kind of comments, like you said, see if they had a mental health history, look for all the different components before you start making quick judgments.
Exactly. And whether they're coming up with a plan, they've conducted surveillance, again, stockpiling weapons, perhaps they've never had an interest in weapons in the past. Now, all of a sudden, that they're obtaining firearms over the internet or going to gun shows or whatever the case may be.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much, Mr. Roche, for coming on The Circle. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Carlos. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Here's the book again, Mass Killers, Mike Roche. You got to get it. It's a fascinating read to understand this very sad and tragic reality that happens to us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever the psychology involved, we're going to be there. We'll see you next time, everyone.